Hi, my name is Breanna Cook, and I'm a junior at Carroll College studying French and Health Sciences. As a part of the Honor Scholars capstone this semester, I have been looking at virtue as a hindrance or necessity to improving the human condition. In looking at virtue, I have been using two different authors, Friedrich Nietzsche and St. Augustine. Both of these authors would agree that virtue is a necessity to improving the human condition, but they also both have very different definitions of virtue. So Augustine and Nietzsche would perceive each other's definitions of virtue to be a hindrance to the human condition. I'm going to start with Augustine's definition of virtue. Augustine doesn't really define virtue, but he does commend and condemn specific actions throughout his text that allows you to determine which actions he believes to be virtuous. A lot of these analyses of different virtues and actions come from his own life because Augustine converted a little bit later in life. He spent his younger years with a life full of vice. So in reflecting on this, some of the virtues that Augustine would promote are humility, chastity, and poverty. In looking at virtue, Augustine also pulls out these ideas of unity and division. He says that in virtue there is unity and in vice a kind of division. So within this unity idea, Augustine believes that unity is the rational mind and the nature of truth and the highest good. So virtue for Augustine is unity, unity is truth, and truth is the highest good. So virtue is the highest good. Vice brings about division, and division is the nature of supreme evil. So division has a lot of effects, negative effects on the human person. These are both psychological and spiritual impacts, and for psychological impacts, Augustine points out that division in his life, for him, when he was living a life of sin, resulted in miserable folly and an agitated mind. So clearly he experienced some sort of internal division within his own life and his own heart. And further, there were spiritual impacts for him. So spiritual impacts negatively are a separation between God and the person, Augustine. And Augustine says that God pushed him away to resist his inflated pride. So these vices, non-virtuous acts, had both a negative psychological and spiritual impact. Virtue for Nietzsche was much different, and he also comments on this Christian idea of virtue that Augustine has. Nietzsche sees this Christian virtue, he terms it as the ascetic ideal, and looks at these same three ideas, these same three acts of poverty, humility, and chastity. He recognizes that the ascetic does constitute the virtues of Christianity, so he ties this in with this direct language of virtue and ascetic and poverty, humility, and a chastity. In his reflection on it, he also saw that in these Christian ideas of pity, self-abnegation, and self-sacrifice, it was precisely here that I saw the great danger to mankind. So he really sees the ascetic ideal and Christian virtue as a hindrance for the improvement of the human person. His dislike of the ascetic comes from the origin, what he perceives to be the origin of the ascetic, and he goes back to Jewish times and Jewish slavery. This idea of a French term, ressentiment, which would be resentment, and resentment referred to the slaves' feelings towards their masters, and this feeling of resentment led to a slave morality. This comes from being oppressed, and as the oppressed people, they can't use power to overcome their masters, so instead they use their weakness as an excuse to redefine good and virtuous. So instead of this Greco-Roman idea of virtue being power, these slaves took goodness and virtue and created a new slave morality, a new form of reality, and a whole new virtue. This came from cleverness. They used cleverness to overcome this reality that they were living in. However, this new virtue was self-deceiving. Instead, Nietzsche takes on this Greco-Roman virtue. He sees that there is nothing of virtue in the ascetic, and he redefines the good man as the noble, as the powerful, as the ruler. He also opposes these unegoistic values of the ascetic ideal, which he sees as a danger to mankind. So now good is useful. What is good is what is valuable to the highest degree. He terms this value system, the opposite of the ascetic, as the will to power. So since power is his form of virtue, his way towards excellence, Augustine says that excellence, power, brings about human flourishing. He defines the will to power as the essence of life and the instinct for freedom. To have power as spontaneous, aggressive, expansive, form-giving forces. In looking at virtue, Nietzsche would actually agree with Augustine that virtue is unified. It brings about unity, because within the human person, if they are pursuing virtue in accordance with Nietzsche's definition of virtue, each of these virtues are unified in the human person for a common goal of dominance and power and nobility. In comparing their definitions of virtue, I was able to pull out different sources for this virtue, which I termed as internal and external sources of virtue. So for Augustine's virtue has a source of the external. It comes from something outside of this world, which for Augustine was God. So his whole identity relies on this existence of God. He says specifically, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, and life in the absence of God is no real life at all. So in order for real life for Augustine, God and this external being outside of this world is necessary. This external reality also deals with life after death. There's something beyond what this world can offer for the human. And therefore, the improvement of the human condition comes with accomplishing virtue by the grace of God to achieve ultimate excellence, which is eternal life. Nietzsche has a more internal source of excellence. He doesn't believe in a God. He doesn't believe in an external reality. Therefore, his source of excellence and the improvement of the human condition relies on ideals found within the world based on worldly success. Excellence is found in the will to power and is also, because it doesn't have an external existence, limited to what can be achieved in a lifetime. I also compared the arguments of Augustine and Nietzsche. So Augustine's life is very telling of his argument and also provides a very convincing argument, because he did come from a life of vice. So his conversion came from a life, or he converted from a life of swelling conceit. He aspired to honors, money, and marriage. But through all of these vices, as defined by Augustine, he also suffered bittersweet difficulties. So he found virtue by knowing what vice was and living a path of vice. So this authentically lived experience by Augustine is compelling in his argument for virtue, for a Christian virtue. Nietzsche's argument I found to be a little contradictory, because he defines ascetic as a sense or an instinct for the preconditions of higher spirituality. However, he spent his text evaluating these value judgments or favorable preconditions. So therefore, Nietzsche himself seemed to be an ascetic. He also didn't seem to be pursuing what he saw as virtue. He wasn't seeking and achieving power. He was living life as a philosopher, which is a form of the ascetic. In conclusion, I found that, well, they had some comparison points, some unified ideas of virtue. Both of them saw virtue as necessary to improving the human condition, and virtue is unified. But in their differences, I found that Augustine's argument and lived experiences are stronger and more convincing. And Nietzsche's philosophy overall with his lifestyle are contradictory. Thank you for watching my surf presentation.